In the winter of 1893, Silas Sterling, the 9th Duke of Ashbourne, was exactly 10 seconds away from destroying his family's legacy. He sat across from a predator, a man who used ink like a weapon. The Duke held the pen, his hand trembling, ready to sign away a 400-year-old estate to a foreign count for a fraction of its worth. Silas thought he was alone in his defeat. He was wrong. He didn't know that the girl pouring the wine, a nobody named Sophie, was the only person in the room who could read the language of his destruction. This is the true-to-life story of how one maid's voice silenced a tyrant and saved a dynasty. The rain in Derbyshire didn't wash things clean. It merely exposed the rot. It was late October 1893. Ashbourne Hall, once the envy of the northern aristocracy, groaned under the assault of the wind. Inside the library, the air smelled of old paper, damp wool, and the distinct metallic scent of anxiety. Silas Sterling, the Duke of Ashbourne, stood by the tall, draughty window, watching the gravel drive. He was 28 years old, though the dark circles beneath his eyes made him look 40. He had inherited the title 3 years ago, along with a mountain of gambling debts from his father and a roof that leaked in 3 separate wings. "He is early, Your Grace," a voice croaked from the shadows. It was Thaddeus Finch, the family solicitor. Finch was a man who looked like he had been pressed between the pages of a law book and forgotten. He sat at the heavy oak desk, arranging papers with trembling fingers. "The Count is a man of precise habits, Finch," Silas said, turning from the window. His waistcoat was silk, but the cuffs were fraying, a detail he hoped the dim gaslight would hide. Men who own half the shipping lines in the Baltic do not arrive late. Silas walked to the fireplace, where a meager fire sputtered. He poked it aggressively. "Tell me again, Finch. Is there no other way? Can we not mortgage the timberlands?" Finch sighed, removing his spectacles to wipe them. "The timber is already leveraged, Your Grace, along with the tenant farms and the London townhouse. Count Volkov is not asking for a mortgage. He is offering a purchase of the debt in exchange for the deed to the estate. It is a bailout. A humiliation, yes, but it keeps you out of debtor's prison." Silas gripped the iron poker until his knuckles turned white. "He turns me into a tenant in my own home. I remain the Duke in name, but he owns the stones, the land, the very portraits on the wall. It is survival, sir." The heavy oak doors creaked open. Silas stiffened, expecting the Count. Instead, a young woman slipped inside, balancing a silver tray. It was Sophie. Sophie Mercer. She moved with the practiced invisibility of the servant class. Her dress was a dull charcoal grey, her white apron starched to perfection. She had been at Ashbourne for 6 months, hired from an orphanage in York. She was quiet, efficient, and possessed eyes of a startling, intelligent hazel that she kept demurely lowered. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The butler, Mr. Henderson, is attending to the carriage. I brought the brandy." Silas nodded absent-mindedly. "Thank you, Sophie. Leave it." Sophie placed the tray on the side table. As she poured the amber liquid into crystal snifters, she glanced at the papers spread across the desk. They were thick, dense documents, heavily stamped with wax seals bearing a crest she didn't recognize, a double-headed eagle gripping a serpent. She paused for a fraction of a second. Her eyes darted across the header of the top document. It wasn't written in English. It wasn't even written in the standard French of diplomacy. "Sophie," Silas said, his voice sharp. "That will be all." She flinched, dipping a curtsy. "Yes, Your Grace." But as she backed out of the room, her gaze lingered on Silas. She saw the desperation in his posture, the way his proud shoulders slumped. She wanted to say something, but she was a maid earning £12 a year, and he was a peer of the realm. The distance between them was greater than the English Channel. She closed the door, but she didn't leave. She stood in the cold hallway, pressing her back against the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that crest, and she knew that the man coming up the drive wasn't coming to save the Duke. He was coming to execute him. Count Casimir Volkov did not walk. He glided. He was a man of imposing height, wrapped in a coat of sable fur that cost more than the entire contents of the Ashbourne Library. His face was sharp, pale, and dominated by eyes the color of glacier ice. He swept into the library with an energy that sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Duke Sterling," Volkov said. His English was perfect, polished, but tainted with a sneer that lay just beneath the surface. "You have a beautiful home, a pity about the damp." Silas straightened his spine, summoning every ounce of his ancestral pride. "Count Volkov, welcome to Ashbourne. Please, sit." Volkov sat, not in the guest chair, but in Silas's own high-backed leather chair behind the desk. It was a calculated power move. Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He took the guest chair, reducing himself to a petitioner in his own library. "Let us dispense with pleasantries," Volkov said, waving a gloved hand. "My time is expensive. You have read the terms?" "I have," Silas said. "My solicitor has reviewed the English summary provided by your clerks." Volkov smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too straight. "Excellent. The arrangement is simple. I absorb your debts, all £40,000. In return, the title of the estate transfers to my holding company in St. Petersburg. You retain life tenancy. You live here, you die here. You remain the Duke. But the asset is mine." Finch cleared his throat. We were hoping to discuss the buyback clause. The summary mentioned a 10-year window where the Duke could repurchase the estate." Volkov's eyes narrowed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a fresh document. It was bound in red ribbon. "The final contract. It is drafted in the standard legal dialect of the Austro-Hungarian Banking Guild, as my assets are currently tied to the Vienna exchange. A formality." He tossed the thick document onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Silas picked it up. The text was a dense thicket of Gothic script. It looked German, but warped, archaic. "I cannot read this. It is merely the legal binding of the English summary you already agreed to," Volkov said smoothly. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his pocket. "Unless, of course, you do not trust the word of a man who is about to save your life?" The silence stretched. Outside, thunder rumbled, shaking the window panes. "I trust you," Silas lied. He felt sick. He reached for the contract. "Wait," Finch squeaked. "Perhaps we should have it translated by a third party in London." Volkov stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I leave for the continent in the morning. If the signature is not on this paper tonight, the deal is void. The bank forecloses on Monday. You choose, Duke. Your pride or your home." Silas looked at Finch. The old lawyer looked terrified. There was no time, no options. "I will sign," Silas whispered. "Excellent," Volkov purred. "We shall celebrate. Champagne?" "We only have claret," Silas muttered. He rang the bell cord. A moment later, the door opened. Sophie entered. She kept her head down, but her hands were trembling so badly the bottle of wine rattled against the tray. She had been listening at the keyhole. She had heard the tone of Volkov's voice, the arrogance, the deception. She moved to the desk to pour the wine. As she approached Volkov, she looked down at the document spread open before the Duke. Her breath hitched. The script wasn't just Austro-Hungarian legalese. It was a specific dialect of High Prussian contract law, mixed with an archaic syntax used by predatory lenders in the darker corners of Vienna. Sophie's mother had been a governess in Vienna for 20 years. She had taught Sophie to read before she taught her to sew. Sophie knew this language. She knew it intimately. And as her eyes scanned the paragraph just above the signature line, the paragraph Silas was about to sign, she saw the word Totalentenung. It didn't mean life tenancy. It meant immediate eviction upon transfer. And the clause below it? Leibeigenschaft. Servitude. If Silas signed this, he wasn't just losing the house. He was agreeing to work as the estate manager for no wage, liable for all future maintenance costs, under threat of debtor's prison in a foreign jurisdiction. It was a slavery contract, dressed in silk. Silas dipped the quill into the inkwell. The black drop of ink swelled at the tip, ready to fall. "Sign here," Volkov commanded, pointing a manicured finger at the line. Silas lowered the pen. Crash. The room froze. Sophie had dropped the crystal decanter. Red wine exploded across the desk, soaking the papers, splashing onto Volkov's pristine sable coat. "You clumsy fool!" Volkov roared, jumping back. "Look what you've done!" Silas stood up, shocked. "Sophie." Sophie didn't apologize. She didn't cower. For the first time, she looked up, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to burn the very air in the room. She looked directly at the Duke. "Don't sign it," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the room like a bell. "He is lying to you, Your Grace. That is not a rescue. It is a death warrant." The silence that followed Sophie's declaration was heavier than the oak beams above them. The spilled wine dripped rhythmically from the edge of the desk onto the Persian rug, drip, 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 counting down the seconds of Silas's shock. Count Volkov recovered first. He snatched a handkerchief from his pocket, dabbing furiously at the crimson stain spreading across his sable lapel. His face, usually a mask of bored aristocracy, twisted into a snarl of genuine ugliness. "Get this creature out of here," Volkov hissed, his voice dropping an octave, losing its polished veneer. "She is drunk. She has ruined a contract worth £50,000. I will have her arrested for assault." "I am not drunk," Sophie said. She did not step back. She did not look at the floor. She kept her eyes fixed on Silas, her hands clenched so tightly in her apron that her knuckles were white. "And that paper is not a contract, Your Grace. It is a confession." Silas looked from the wet, ruined papers to the maid he had barely noticed for 6 months. He saw a woman terrified but resolute, like a soldier standing before a firing squad. "Explain yourself, Sophie," Silas said, quietly. "She is a servant," Volkov barked, standing up. "She washes floors. What could she possibly know of international jurisprudence?" "I know that Totalentenung does not mean life tenancy," Sophie cut in, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. She switched seamlessly to German, her accent crisp and distinctly Austrian. "Es bedeutet die vollständige Beschlagnahme von Eigentum ohne Entschädigung." She switched back to English. "It means total expropriation without compensation." And the clause below it, Schuldknechtschaft, allows the creditor to detain the debtor in a private workhouse until the interest is paid. The interest rate listed on page 4 is 40%. Compounded weekly. You would never pay it off. You would die his prisoner, Your Grace. Finch, the solicitor, gasped, scrambling to pick up the sodden document. He held it close to the gas lamp, squinting. God in heaven. The girl is reading the Gothic script. I thought it was decorative. Silas felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a cold, hard rage. He looked at Volkov. The Count had stopped wiping his coat. He stood perfectly still, his eyes narrowing into slits of glacial ice. The pretense of the benevolent saviour evaporated. "You speak the Austrian legal dialect," Volkov said softly, analysing Sophie as if she were a fascinating, poisonous insect. "A scullery maid in Derbyshire? How?" "My mother was not a maid," Sophie said, lifting her chin. "She was a governess to the von Klein family in Vienna for 20 years. She taught me to read contracts before she taught me my prayers. She said men like you are the reason we need both." Silas stepped around the desk. The physical distance between him and the Count closed. Silas was not a man of violence. He was a scholar, a gambler, a wastrel. But the insult to his intelligence and the threat to his freedom woke something dormant in his blood. "Is it true?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous. Volkov buttoned his coat, regaining his composure with terrifying speed. "It is a standard clause in high-risk lending, Duke Sterling. You are a bankrupt gambler with a crumbling estate. You are not in a position to negotiate terms. You are a drowning man, and I am the only boat in the ocean." "You are a shark," Silas spat. "I am a businessman," Volkov snapped, "and you have until noon tomorrow. If the debt is not settled, the bank in London will seize this property. They will auction your furniture, your horses, and your family portraits. You will be on the street. My offer, draconian as it may be, kept a roof over your head. But now," he gestured to the wine-soaked papers, "now, the deal is void. I withdraw my offer." Volkov walked to the door, stepping over the puddle of wine. He paused, his hand on the brass knob, and looked back at Sophie. "You have made a grave mistake, Fräulein," Volkov said. "You think you have saved him? You have only accelerated his ruin. And as for you, no one hires a maid who assaults a count. Enjoy your night. It will be your last at Ashbourne." The door slammed. The echo rattled the windows. Silas stood frozen. The adrenaline faded, leaving him with the crushing weight of reality. Volkov was right. The fraud was exposed, but the debt remained. "Finch," Silas said hoarsely, "how much time do we actually have?" "The bank opens at 9, Finch whispered, sinking into a chair. "They will file the foreclosure writ by 10. We are finished, Your Grace. Without Volkov's capital, Ashbourne falls tomorrow." Silas closed his eyes. He felt a light touch on his sleeve. He opened them to see Sophie standing there, the empty silver tray tucked under her arm. "Not necessarily, Your Grace," she said softly. "Sophie," Silas sighed, rubbing his temples. "You were brave, truly. You saved me from slavery, but you cannot save me from bankruptcy. Go downstairs. Pack your things. I will write you a letter of reference before I leave." "I don't want a reference," Sophie said, stepping closer, ignoring the boundaries of her station. "I want to see the rest of the papers." Silas blinked. "What?" "The papers Volkov brought," she insisted. "The ones he didn't ask you to sign. The survey maps. The manifest. He didn't just want the house, sir. A man like that doesn't fly from Vienna to Derbyshire for a leaky roof and damp wool. He wants something specific. If we find out what it is, we have a weapon." Silas looked at the maid, really looked at her. Her hair was escaping her cap, framing a face that was intelligent, fierce, and alive. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the dark. "Finch," Silas commanded, "pour the girl a glass of brandy. We have work to do." The library clock chimed 3. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows against the shelves of leather-bound books. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The strict hierarchy of the Victorian household had dissolved in the face of crisis. Silas sat on the floor, surrounded by maps of the estate dating back to 1650. Finch was asleep in the armchair, snoring softly. Sophie sat at the Duke's massive desk, a position that would have been scandalous hours ago, poring over the supplemental documents Volkov had left behind in his haste. Silas watched her for a moment. She had removed her white apron and cap, placing them on a chair. In her plain grey dress, with her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, she looked less like a servant and more like the scholars he used to debate with at Oxford. "You have a mind for this," Silas murmured, tracing the boundary line of the East Woods on a map. "Most of my peers can hardly read a ledger, let alone analyze a geological survey." Sophie didn't look up, her finger tracing a column of figures. "Poverty is a harsh teacher, Your Grace. When you have nothing, you learn to count every penny, every crumb, and every word. You learn that the fine print is where the traps are." "Please," he said, "call me Silas, at least for tonight. If we fail, I shall be a commoner by noon anyway." She looked up then, a faint blush touching her cheeks. "I could not, sir. It wouldn't be right." "Then tell me," Silas asked, leaning back against the leg of the desk. "Why did you stay? You could have run. Volkov is a powerful enemy." "My father," she said quietly. "He was a tenant farmer. He lost his land to a man like Volkov, a document with words he couldn't read. He died of a broken heart working in a factory in Leeds. I swore if I ever saw a man holding a pen like a knife again, I wouldn't stay silent." The vulnerability in her voice struck Silas hard. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted his title, his money, or his influence. Here was a woman who had risked everything simply because it was right. "I'm sorry about your father," Silas said, "and I am sorry I did not see you before tonight." "You saw me," Sophie said with a small, sad smile. "You just didn't see me." "I see you now," he said. The air between them grew charged, a tension that had nothing to do with the debt and everything to do with the sudden intimacy of the moment. Sophie broke the gaze, looking back down at the papers. Suddenly she frowned. She pulled a second document closer, a railway schedule, and compared it to the geological survey. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp, "look at this." Silas scrambled up and leaned over her shoulder. He could smell soap and lavender. "What is it?" "This survey," she pointed. "It was commissioned by Volkov 3 months ago. It analyzes the soil composition of the Black Ridge, the rocky land on the northern edge of your estate, the land you've always considered useless." "It is useless," Silas said. "Nothing grows there, just sheep and heather." "Not on the surface," Sophie said, her eyes widening. "But look at the chemical notation here. Kaolinite." "Clay?" Silas asked, confused. "Not just clay," Sophie said, her mind racing. "China clay, the purest kind. And look at this railway manifest. The Great Northern Line is planning an expansion next year. The proposed track runs right past the Black Ridge." Silas stared at the map. The pieces clicked into place. "He doesn't want the house," Silas whispered. "He wants the clay. With the railway coming, that ridge isn't a sheep pasture. It's a mine. A fortune." "A fortune worth 10 times your debt," Sophie confirmed. He knew the railway was coming before the public announcement. "That's insider trading. It's fraud." Silas laughed. It was a dry, incredulous sound. The bastard. He was going to steal £40,000 of debt and trade it for £1 million of clay. "We have him," Sophie said, a grin breaking across her face. "If we take this to the bank manager in the morning, if we show him the clay deposits and the railway plans, the bank won't foreclose. They will extend your credit based on the future value of the asset." Silas looked at her, overwhelmed by a sudden surge of hope and admiration. He impulsively reached out and took her hands. They were rough, calloused from scrubbing floors. But to him, they felt like the most precious things in the room. "You did it," he said. "Sophie, you did it." For a moment they stood there, hands clasped, the barrier of class forgotten. Silas leaned in, drawn by the gravity of her intelligence and her courage. Sophie's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. Bang! The heavy front door of the manor slammed open downstairs. Voices echoed in the hall. Heavy boots stomped on the stairs. Finch woke up with a snort. "What? What is it?" Silas dropped Sophie's hands, his face hardening. "He's back!" It was not morning yet, only 4 a.m., but the peace of the night was shattered. Silas threw open the library doors and stepped out onto the landing. Sophie followed close behind. In the grand foyer below, the gas lamps had been lit. Count Volkov stood at the foot of the stairs. But he was not alone. Flanking him were 2 men who looked nothing like lawyers. They were broad, dressed in rough tweeds, with the flattened noses of prize fighters. Behind them stood a man in a bowler hat, Sheriff Higgins, the local law enforcement. "Sheriff," Silas called out, descending the stairs slowly, trying to project an authority he didn't feel. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a raid at this ungodly hour?" "My apologies, Your Grace," Sheriff Higgins said, looking uncomfortable. He took off his hat, twisting it in his hands. "The Count here. He has sworn out a complaint, a serious one." "Trespassing?" Silas asked coolly. "In my own home." "Theft," Volkov said. His voice was smooth again, the rage from earlier buried under a layer of smug triumph. He walked up the first 2 steps. "And fraud." "You are the fraud, Volkov," Silas retorted. "We know about the china clay. We know about the railway. We know what you were trying to steal." Volkov's eyes flickered. For a second he looked surprised, but he masked it quickly. "Fanciful stories, but irrelevant. I am not here for you, Duke Sterling. I am here for her." He pointed a gloved finger at Sophie, who stood at the top of the stairs. "Me?" Sophie whispered. "Sheriff," Volkov said. "Arrest that woman. Her name is not Sophie Mercer, and she is not a maid." Higgins sighed. "Miss, step forward, please." "What is the meaning of this?" Silas demanded, moving to block the stairs. "She is my employee under my protection." Volkov pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "Is she? Because I sent a telegram to the orphanage in York she claims to be from. They have no record of a Sophie Mercer. However, the authorities in Vienna have a record of a Sophie von Klein, the illegitimate daughter of a disgraced governess, wanted for the theft of a diamond brooch from her mother's employer before fleeing the country." Sophie gasped. "That's a lie. My mother was owed wages. She took the brooch as collateral because they refused to pay her while she was dying." "So you admit the theft," Volkov smiled, "and you admit you falsified your references to enter this house. That is fraud, my dear. And harboring a fugitive." He looked at Silas. "That is a crime, too, Your Grace." Silas looked back at Sophie. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. She didn't deny it. The complexity of her past, the reason she was so educated, the reason she was hiding in a Derbyshire manor. It all made sense. "Sheriff," Volkov commanded, "take her. And Duke, if you want to keep this scandal quiet, if you want to avoid being dragged into court as an accomplice to a jewel thief, I suggest we sign those papers now. The original deal. No clay, no railway, just the house for the debt. And I will drop the charges against the girl." It was a checkmate. Sophie gripped the banister. She looked at Silas. She saw the conflict in his eyes. If he fought for her, he would be ruined by the scandal, and he would still lose the estate. If he signed, he saved himself, and he saved her from prison. But he lost his heritage and the fortune that lay beneath the ground. Silas, Sophie whispered, using his name for the first time. Don't sign. Let them take me. The estate matters more. Silas looked at the woman who had fought for him when he was ready to surrender. He looked at Volkov, who stood gloating, believing that every man had a price and every woman was disposable. Silas slowly walked down the stairs until he was face to face with the Count. You think you have won? Silas said quietly. I have won, Volkov replied. Sign the papers, give me the deed, and the girl goes free. Refuse, and she rots in Newgate prison, and you lose the estate anyway when the bank opens. Silas turned to the sheriff. Sheriff Higgins, Silas said, his voice ringing off the marble walls. Count Volkov accuses this woman of theft, but there is a problem with his accusation. And what is that, Your Grace? Higgins asked. Silas reached back and took Sophie's hand, pulling her down the stairs to stand beside him. He squeezed her fingers tight, a silent promise. A wife cannot steal from her husband, Silas lied. The silence in the hall was absolute. What? Volkov choked out. Sophie is not my maid, Silas announced, his heart hammering against his ribs. She is my fiancée. We have been privately engaged for a month. Whatever property she holds is now mine by marital right, and I do not press charges. Volkov's face turned a violent shade of purple. This is absurd. You are lying. You cannot marry a servant. I am the Duke of Ashbourne, Silas said, drawing himself up to his full height. I can marry whomever I damn well please. Now get out of my house, Volkov, or I will have you arrested for trespassing on the future Duchess's property. Volkov stared at them, the Duke in his silk, the maid in her wool, holding hands like a wall of stone. He signalled to his thugs. This isn't over, Volkov spat. I will be back with the bank examiners at 9. Let us see if your fiancée can conjure £40,000 out of thin air. He spun on his heel and stormed out, the heavy doors slamming shut behind him. Sophie turned to Silas, her knees shaking. You didn't mean that. You can't mean that. Silas looked at her, his eyes intense. We have 4 hours until the bank opens, Sophie. We have to find a way to make that lie the truth, or we are both finished. The carriage rattled violently as it tore down the muddy lane, the horses foaming at the mouth. It was still dark, the pre-dawn mist clinging to the Derbyshire hills like a shroud. Inside, the air was cold, but the tension between Silas and Sophie made the small cabin feel suffocatingly hot. You took a terrible risk, Sophie said, gripping the leather strap as the carriage lurched around a bend. Lying to the sheriff, declaring an engagement to a servant. If this fails, you will be the laughing stock of London. Silas sat opposite her, his face illuminated by the flickering carriage lantern. He looked tired, but the despair that had haunted him for 3 years was gone, replaced by a steely determination. I did not lie, Sophie, Silas said, his voice steady. Sophie looked up, startled. Your Grace? I said I did not lie, he repeated, leaning forward. A duke cannot marry a commoner, it is true. Society would tear us apart. But I am not just a duke anymore, am I? I am a man who was ready to sign his life away, saved by a woman who had every reason to let him fall. In the last 4 hours, you have been more of a partner to me than any peer I have ever known. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't the massive Ashbourne diamond that was locked in a vault in London. It was a simple gold band set with a small ruby. This was my mother's signet ring, Silas said. She wore it when she rode. It is the only piece of jewellery Volkov's auditors didn't catalogue. He took Sophie's hand. She tried to pull away, her heart pounding. Silas, you cannot, she whispered. I am a thief. You heard Volkov. I took the brooch. Why? Silas asked, holding her hand firm. Tell me the truth, not the legal truth, the real truth. Sophie looked out the window at the passing darkness. Tears welled in her eyes. My mother worked for the von Kleins for 20 years. When she fell ill with consumption, they dismissed her without her pension. They said she was too weak to be useful. We were starving. The brooch was on the vanity. I didn't steal it to wear it. I stole it to buy her medicine. It bought her 3 more months of life. I would do it again. Silas listened, his expression softening into profound sorrow. That is not a crime, Sophie. That is a sacrifice, and Volkov uses it as a leash to choke you. He slid the ruby ring onto her finger. It was slightly too big, but it glowed warmly in the dim light. Let this be the chain that breaks his leash, Silas said. We are going to the Derby and Derbyshire Banking Company. We are going to see Mr. Abernathy, and we are going to present him with the geological surveys. But we are not going as a debtor and his maid. We are going as the Duke of Ashbourne and his future Duchess, the shrewd business manager who discovered the clay. And if he doesn't believe us? Sophie asked, twisting the ring. If Volkov gets there first? Volkov is travelling by the main road, Silas said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He thinks he has won. He will be stopping for a leisurely breakfast. We are taking the sheep drover's path over the ridge. It is dangerous, steep, and muddy, but it will shave an hour off our journey. Suddenly the carriage slammed to a halt. The horses whinnied in panic. Trouble! The coachman shouted from above. Silas kicked the door open and jumped out into the mud. A large oak tree had fallen across the narrow track, blocking the path completely. Silas cursed. The storm brought it down. Sophie jumped out beside him. The rain was falling harder now. They were 10 miles from Derby. If they turned back to the main road, they would be behind Volkov. They would arrive too late. We can't move it, Silas said, pushing uselessly against the massive trunk. It weighs a ton. Sophie looked at the horses. They were powerful Clydesdale crosses, bred for farm work, not speed. She looked at the tree, then at the chains hanging from the carriage undercarriage. Unhitch the horses, Sophie commanded. Silas looked at her. What? Unhitch them! She yelled over the wind, hiking up her skirts and wading into the mud. This is a drover's path. These horses know how to pull dead weight. If we chain the tree to the harness, we can drag it just enough to squeeze the carriage through. Silas stared at her for a second, then grinned. He stripped off his expensive silk coat, throwing it into the mud, and rolled up his sleeves. You heard the lady? Henderson, bring the chains. For 20 minutes, the Duke of Ashbourne and the fugitive maid worked side by side in the freezing rain, ankle-deep in muck, struggling with iron chains and wet bark. They pulled and shouted commands to the horses, heaving and pushing until their muscles burned. With a groan of timber, the great oak shifted. Just enough. Breathless, soaked to the bone, and covered in mud, Silas looked at Sophie. Her hair was wild, her face streaked with dirt, her dress ruined. You look, Silas panted, wiping mud from his forehead. Absolutely magnificent. Sophie laughed, a sound of pure adrenaline. We have an hour, Silas. Drive. The city of Derby was waking up to a grey, industrial morning, oblivious to the desperate race taking place on its outskirts. The clock tower of the Guildhall began to toll the hour of 9. Each heavy, brassy strike vibrated through the wet cobblestones, sounding less like a bell and more like a gavel banging down on a judge's bench. Bong. Silas whipped the reins, his hands raw and blistering against the leather. The horses, their flanks heaving with steam and sweat, skidded around the final corner onto Cornmarket Street. Bong. There! Sophie cried out, pointing a trembling, mud-splattered finger. "The bank! The carriage is already there!" She was right. Parked directly in front of the imposing stone facade of the Derby and Derbyshire Banking Company was Count Volkov's black carriage. It sat pristine and dry, the driver buffing a speck of dust from the lacquer, a stark contrast to the battered, mud-caked vehicle that Silas now pulled to a screeching halt behind it. Bong. 9 o'clock, Silas gasped, his chest heaving. He didn't wait for the footman. He threw himself from the driver's seat, landing heavily in a puddle of gutter water. He didn't care. The adrenaline that had carried them over the ridge and through the fallen timber was spiking now, turning his vision sharp and tunneled. He ran to the carriage door and wrenched it open for Sophie. She stumbled out, her legs weak from the brutal physical labor of moving the tree. She looked a wreck. Her grey wool dress was torn at the hem, heavy with water and plastered to her skin. Her hair had come completely undone, a dark, wild curtain matted with rain and leaves. She looked nothing like a lady, and certainly nothing like a maid. She looked like a survivor of a shipwreck. "Can you run?" Silas asked, gripping her arm to steady her. Sophie looked at the grand double doors of the bank. She took a breath that rattled in her lungs. "I didn't come this far to walk, Silas." They took the marble steps 2 at a time, leaving a trail of brown slurry on the pristine white stone. Inside, the lobby of the Derby and Derbyshire Banking Company was a cathedral of commerce. It was a space designed to intimidate, high-vaulted ceilings painted with frescoes of industry, polished brass teller cages, and a silence so profound that the scratching of quill pens sounded like whispers. At the far end of the room, past the rows of staring clerks, lay the sanctuary of the bank president, Mr. Abernathy. Inside that office, the air smelled of beeswax, expensive cigar smoke, and victory. Count Casimir Volkov sat in a red leather armchair, legs crossed, inspecting the manicured cuticles of his fingernails. He was the picture of continental elegance, his sable coat draped over the chair, his suit uncreased. Across the desk, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose side whiskers were as wide as his ledger, dipped his pen into the inkwell. "It is a regrettable business, Count," Abernathy murmured, his voice lacking any genuine regret. "The Sterling family has banked with us since the days of George III. To see the estate foreclosed upon, it is the end of an era." "Evolution, Abernathy," Volkov said, checking his pocket watch. "The dinosaurs died to make room for the mammals. The Duke is a dinosaur. He consumes resources he does not understand and produces nothing but debt. I am merely natural selection." Abernathy nodded, sliding the foreclosure writ across the mahogany desk. "The clock has struck 9. No funds have been wired. The deed transfers to you upon my signature." The pen hovered over the paper. The black ink pooled at the nib, a single drop ready to seal the fate of Ashbourne Hall. Crash! The double doors of the office didn't just open, they exploded inward, rebounding off the oak panelling with a violence that made Abernathy jump so hard he dropped his pen. A blot of ink splattered across the blotter, missing the contract by an inch. Volkov turned, a sneer already forming on his lips, expecting a servant. Instead, he saw a nightmare. Silas Sterling stood in the doorway, chest heaving, water dripping from his nose and chin. His silk waistcoat was ruined, his knuckles were bleeding, and his eyes were burning with a terrifying intensity. Beside him stood the girl, the nobody, looking like a vengeful spirit risen from the bog. "Do not," Silas wheezed, his voice cracking before booming into a command that shook the glass in the windows. "Sign that paper." The silence that followed was absolute. Every clerk in the outer lobby had frozen. Volkov stood up slowly, brushing an invisible speck of lint from his lapel. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ah, the drowned rats have arrived. How dramatic, and how utterly futile. You are too late, Sterling, Abernathy sputtered, recovering his composure and reaching for a rag to wipe the ink from his desk. It is 5 minutes past the hour. Unless you have £40,000 in gold bullion in your pockets, this meeting is over. Please remove yourself and your woman from my bank before I call the constable. I don't have gold, Silas said, stepping into the room, leaving wet footprints on the Persian rug. He walked straight to the desk, ignoring Volkov entirely. I have something better. I have the future. Riddles will not pay your mortgage, Volkov scoffed. Sheriff Higgins is on his way, Duke. I suggest you leave with what little dignity you have left. Silas reached inside his sodden coat. For a tense moment, Volkov flinched, perhaps fearing a pistol. But Silas pulled out a roll of parchment, the edges pulpy with water, and slammed it onto the desk. Maps? Abernathy asked, looking down his nose. I have maps of your estate, Your Grace. They show sheep paddocks and timber rot. Not these maps, Sophie said. Her voice cut through the male posturing, sharp, clear, and authoritative. She stepped forward, pushing wet hair out of her eyes. She placed her hand on the desk, right next to the Duke's. These are geological surveys, Sophie announced, her Austrian accent thickening slightly with her intensity. Commissioned by Count Volkov himself 3 months ago. Hidden from you, Mr. Abernathy, and hidden from the Duke. Volkov's face lost its color. He lunged forward. These are private property, stolen documents. Silas caught Volkov's wrist in mid-air. The Duke's grip was like iron. All the rage of the last 3 years, all the humiliation, was channeled into that grip. He shoved the Count back. Sit down, Volkov. You're not the one giving orders anymore. Sophie didn't flinch. She unrolled the damp paper, smoothing it out. Mr. Abernathy, look at the chemical notation for the North Ridge. Sector 4. Abernathy, driven by a banker's curiosity, put on his spectacles. He leaned in. Sector 4, rock and scrub. Wait. He squinted. Al2Si 205 OH4. That's the formula for kaolinite, Sophie finished for him. High-purity china clay. Abernathy looked up, his mouth slightly open. China clay? In Derbyshire? In those quantities? Millions of tons of it, Sophie pressed, pulling the second document, the stolen railway schedule, from her apron pocket. And this is the expansion plan for the Great Northern Railway. They break ground in spring. The line runs within 2 miles of the ridge. That means direct transport to the potteries in Stoke-on-Trent. Sophie looked directly at the banker. She spoke the language of commerce now, the language she had learned listening to wealthy men cheat her father. Sir, if you foreclose today, you sell this estate to the Count for £40,000. He digs the mine, uses the railway he knew was coming, and makes $500,000 in the first 5 years. The bank gets nothing but the interest on a bad loan. She paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. But, she continued, if you refuse the foreclosure and restructure the Duke's debt into a business development loan, the bank becomes a partner in the Ashbourne Clay Company. You don't just get your $40,000 back, you get a percentage of the extraction rights for the next century. Abernathy was a man of little imagination, but he was a man of great greed. He looked at the map. He looked at the chemical formula. He looked at the railway schedule. The math was doing itself in his head. Is this authenticated? Abernathy whispered, looking at Volkov. Count? Did you commission this survey? Volkov stood frozen. If he denied it, he claimed the asset was worthless, destroying his own reason for buying it. If he admitted it, he admitted to withholding material information from the bank to secure a foreclosure, a distinct form of fraud. It was preliminary speculation, Volkov choked out, his voice tight. Unproven. It is stamped by the Royal Geological Society, Silas roared, pointing to the seal on the corner of the map. Don't lie, Casimir. You tried to steal my birthright for pennies on the pound. Abernathy slowly closed the heavy ledger book. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. He looked at Volkov with the cold, dead eyes of a financier who has realized he is being played. Preliminary speculation, you say? It seems, Count, that your due diligence was more thorough than mine. I thank you for bringing this asset to our attention. Abernathy turned to Silas. Your Grace, given this new collateral, the bank is willing to extend your credit. We will capitalize the mining operation. The foreclosure is cancelled. Silas let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 years. He slumped slightly, the relief hitting him like a physical blow. He turned to Sophie, a grin breaking through the mud on his face. But the victory was not yet won. Sheriff! Volkov screamed. The shout spun everyone around. Sheriff Higgins had just pushed his way through the crowd of clerks in the lobby, entering the office with 2 deputies behind him. He looked uncomfortable, his bowler hat in his hands, but his face was grim. Sheriff Higgins, Volkov hissed, pointing a trembling finger at Sophie. Do your duty. That woman is a thief and a fugitive. I want her in irons immediately. The air in the room turned to ice. The joy vanished from Silas's face. Sheriff? Silas asked, stepping in front of Sophie, shielding her with his body. What is this? I'm sorry, Your Grace, Higgins said, looking at the floor. The Count, he swore out a warrant this morning. He claims the lass is Sophie von Klein, wanted in Vienna for the theft of a diamond brooch. He has the telegrams from the Austrian police to prove it. Sophie shrank back against the desk. The mention of her real name stripped away her armor. She was no longer the brilliant translator. She was the frightened orphan again. It was my mother's wages, she whispered, her voice breaking. I only took what was owed. The law does not care about your sob stories, Volkov gloated, stepping forward, his arrogance returning in a rush. She is a criminal, Abernathy. You cannot enter into a business contract with a felon. If the Duke harbors her, he is an accomplice. Arrest her, Sheriff. And then, Mr. Abernathy, we shall see if the bank wishes to do business with a disgraced peer in a prison cell. It was a masterstroke of malice. Volkov was willing to burn everything down if he couldn't have the prize. Sheriff Higgins stepped forward, pulling a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. Miss, you'll have to come with me. We can sort it out before the magistrate. No, Silas said. Your Grace, don't make this harder, Higgins warned. I said no. Silas didn't move. He looked at Volkov, then at the sheriff, and finally at Abernathy, who was watching with wide, scandalized eyes. Silas reached into his wet pocket. His hand closed around the cold metal of the object he had carried with him since he was a boy. The Count claims a debt is owed, Silas said, his voice deadly calm. He claims a theft of £50. He pulled his hand out and slammed a heavy object onto Abernathy's desk. It wasn't money, it was a pocket watch. But not just any watch. It was a masterpiece of 18th century craftsmanship. Solid gold, encrusted with sapphires, bearing the royal crest of the House of Stuart. It had been a gift from a king to the first Duke of Ashbourne. This is the Ashbourne timepiece, Silas declared. It is insured for 200 guineas. It is worth more than this man's entire wardrobe. Silas slid the watch across the desk toward Volkov. It spun on the polished wood, coming to a rest right in front of the Count. Take it, Silas commanded. Consider the debt paid. Consider the stolen item purchased with interest. Volkov stared at the watch. This is irregular. You cannot simply pay a criminal's debt to stop an arrest. I can, Silas said. If the debt belongs to my wife. The sheriff froze. Your wife, Your Grace? Silas turned to Sophie. He took her cold, mud-stained hands in his. He didn't care about the banker. He didn't care about the Count. He looked only at her. Sophie and I are engaged, Silas lied. Or perhaps in that moment he finally told the truth. Under English common law, a husband is liable for his wife's premarital debts. I have assumed the liability. I have paid the debt. There is no theft. There is only a civil dispute which has been settled. He turned his glare back to the sheriff. Is there any other reason you wish to detain the future Duchess of Ashbourne on her wedding day? Higgins looked at the watch, then at the Duke's fierce expression. He knew when he was beaten, and frankly, he liked the Duke a hell of a lot more than the foreign Count. No, Your Grace, Higgins said, holstering his handcuffs. If the debt is paid, it's a civil matter. No crime committed. Volkov let out a sound like a strangled cat. He snatched the watch from the desk, his face turning a violent shade of purple. You are throwing away a royal heirloom for a servant. You are mad. You will be the laughingstock of the Empire. I am trading a watch for a future, Silas said coldly. Now get out of my sight, Volkov, before I ask the sheriff to investigate your railway speculation for insider trading. Volkov froze. He looked at the maps, then at the sheriff, who was now eyeing him with suspicion. He realized he was outmaneuvered. He had the watch, but he had lost the fortune. With a swirl of his sable coat, Count Casimir Volkov stormed out of the office, pushing past the clerks, a defeated man with a very expensive pocket watch and nothing else. The room fell quiet. The storm outside lashed against the windows, but inside, the air was calm. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. He looked at the muddy, dishevelled couple standing before him. Well, the banker said, picking up his pen again. That was most unorthodox. But business is business. Your Grace, if you would sign the loan restructuring agreement, and perhaps Miss Mercer, or should I say, the future Duchess, could verify the chemical assays. Silas didn't look at the papers. He was still looking at Sophie. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a trembling warmth in its wake. Sophie? He asked softly, his voice vulnerable for the first time that day. Did I overstep? Sophie looked down at her dirty dress, then at the ruby ring on her finger, and finally up into the eyes of the man who had just traded a king's gift for her freedom. She saw no hesitation in him, no regret. She smiled, and it was brighter than any diamond brooch. No, Silas, she whispered, squeezing his hand. You translated perfectly. She turned to the banker, her head held high, looking every inch the lady of the manor. Give me the pen, Mr. Abernathy, she said. We have a mine to dig. And that is the story of how Sophie Mercer and Silas Sterling turned the tables on a tyrant. In the end, the silence of the Maid was the loudest thing in the room. History is full of moments like this, where the fate of empires and estates hangs on a single sentence, understood by the one person nobody was watching. Ashbourne Hall still stands today in Derbyshire, though the clay mines have long since closed. If you visit, you might see a portrait in the hallway, not of a duke in his finery, but of a woman with dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, holding a book, the Duchess who saved the dynasty. If you enjoyed this story of wit, courage, and justice, please hit the like button. It helps us bring more of these hidden histories to life. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a twist. What would you have done in Sophie's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.